Battle in Warhammer 3 can take a variety of forms, based on which two factions are going against each other, as well as their armies, battle strategies, and compositions. Today, we're going to go through each of these strategies, their pros and cons, as well as compositions and factions that they work best with. Turtling is the easiest strategy by far, since you pretty much just set up your units and leave them to it with very few orders going out once the battle starts. You want to set up your front lines in either a solid line or a C shape to give extra protection against flankers. Behind this, you want to have any ranged infantry, and at the very back, have some long-range artillery. This strategy only works for factions and armies that have strong long-ranged units, as the entire point is to force the enemy to come attack you and fire at them the entire time. Against enemies with their own artillery, you can still do this and force some of their units to come take you out, but you'll need something to go and get rid of their artillery too to keep everything safe. Factions that can use this strategy well are Dwarfs, the Empire, Skaven, and the Vampire Coast. It's best used against armies with no real long range of their own to ensure you can sit still the entire battle without having to worry about extra damage coming your way. Factions like the Vampire Count and Norska are particularly weak to this strategy, as they have very limited ranged units, so we'll need to close the gap pretty much every time. As for the overall pros and cons of the strategy, it's obviously super easy to set up most of the time, and is pulled off without a hitch. If all goes to plan, the only orders you will need to give once the battle begins will be telling ranged units what exactly to shoot at, and some minor moving around with melee troops if the enemy tries to flank. Your only real issue is the fact that all of your damage is in the back lines units, so if your front lines get overwhelmed or you get flanked, you can lose all the damage dealers in your army and face near certain defeat. Most of the time, you're also blowing your units together in a tight formation, so any damage from enemy spells or explosive missiles will get a ton of value no matter where they aim. Next up, we have Rush. This one is another that's actually really simple to explain, but ends up being a little bit harder to pull off since you actually have to give orders this time. Rush does exactly what it says in the tin. Your entire army rushes at the enemy to engage in melee as quickly as possible, not giving them any time to set up a proper defense. Normally, this strategy mostly involves melee infantry and monsters to overwhelm the enemy front lines in moments and push their way into the back lines. You also normally accompany them with some faster cav units to get around and take out back lines at the same time to put pressure on every area of the battle at once. Factions that can use this strategy well are the Beastmen, Vampire Counts, and most of the Chaos factions. It works best versus armies that rely on their ranged units to do all their fighting, so basically any army that can use the turtling strategy. Now, you do have to make peace with the fact that you'll take some hits before you hit combat, but if you pick the quickest units you can, then it won't be quite as painful, especially if you can get some Vanguard deployment added on. Factions this works best against are those with slower speeds overall like the Dwarves, and those that rely entirely on ranged units for their damage like the Vampire Coast. Rushing when it goes well can feel like the easiest win in the game, since you literally just sprint at enemies and roll straight over them. If you can safely get into their backlines and take them out, then you have a pretty free victory almost guaranteed. However, rushing does up the micromanagement considerably from turtling, since you need to give quick orders to match the quick pace of the battle. Choosing targets for all of your units and making sure they're on the right path towards the right units can take a lot of management, so you need to make sure you're staying on top of things to keep it running smoothly. Rushing also carries a lot more risk of casualties over turtling, since most of the time you'll be sprinting at enemies with a lot of range, so chances are your units will take some shots before they even make contact with the enemy. This can be mitigated with some pathing and use of terrain, but most of the time you'll take at least a few hits before you get a chance to land any. You just need to make sure that they don't totally cripple your plan. Next up, Hammer and Anvil. This is one that you've almost certainly heard of if you've played Total War for any amount of time, as it is by far one of the most effective methods in the game for using cavalry. Essentially, all Hammer and Anvil is waiting for both sides of melee infantry to get into combat, then using your cav to charge the backs of the enemy troops before pulling out to do it over and over and over again. Your melee troops are the Anvil, holding the enemy still, and your cav are the Hammer, beating 50 shades of shit out of them. Normally this is used as part of an army that has some cav in it rather than as a whole army, but you could easily fully commit to that bit and have half and half split of front lines units and cav troops. Obviously Bretonnia is the first faction that comes to mind that can use this strat well, but honestly most factions can make use of this in some way, since almost everyone has a decent front line and some decent shot cav. All you need is some infantry that aren't going to melt in seconds, and cav with high charge bonus. This works best versus factions that have a fairly immobile front line, since you don't want them leaving the front lines once they get there. It doesn't really matter if it's infantry or monsters or both, as long as you keep charging, the damage will keep coming. To be honest, there are a few comps that this does not work well against. The only real threat is armies with fast units that can chase down and take out your cav before they can do any charging. This strat always pumps damage in large waves, which can shatter enemy leadership much quicker than sustain damage over a longer period of time. When done properly, it's also very low risk to your own army, since the front line should be defense focused, so take limited damage, and you'll be pulling the cav out before they take too many hits anyway. There are only really two downsides to this strategy. First is if the enemy has high enough damage, they can take out either front lines or your cav. The entire Hammer and Anvil strategy needs both parts, so if either gets taken out, you're in a lot of trouble. Secondly, is this strat requires a ton of micromanagement. You need to be constantly moving units in and out of combat, and the more cav units you add to this, the harder it becomes to stay in control. There will never be a point in battles where you don't need to give orders, so if you can't handle that, then this is probably not the strategy for you. And the last strategy we're going to cover today is Skirmishing. This is another one that can take a lot of micro to use correctly, and is a massive risk if you don't pull it off perfectly. Essentially, what you're doing in this strategy is shooting enemy units whilst running away from them to take them out before they get close. You know when you have ranged units that can fire whilst moving all around them and you turn on skirmish? This entire strategy is basically doing that on a large scale, but with a lot more manual management. Now this is a very micro-intensive strategy that can only really be used by factions that have elite ranged units that can fire in any direction whilst moving, and have high enough speed that they can outrun most targets they come across. To me, the only faction that can reliably do this for the entire game are the Wood Elves, with most factions' late game units lacking one of the core components that makes this strat work. It's also very reliant on what you're fighting against, since the wrong enemy army can also make this almost impossible to pull off. You need to be against an enemy that's slow moving than your own and doesn't have a lot of ranged. If they can catch up to you, then you'll get pulled into melee, likely with a load of units that have no place fighting. If they have a lot of range themselves, they can just keep their distance and shoot back at you, meaning it just ends up who can shoot the other one to death faster. If you use this strategy right, with the right army against the right foe, it can be one of the safest in the game, as you take units out without ever getting close. As long as you don't run out of ammo, you can avoid damage altogether. Now the downsides of this strategy are basically everything else. If the enemy isn't right, then you're done. If your army isn't right, then you're done. Hell, if the map isn't right and you get caught on some terrain, guess what? You're done. Even if the conditions are perfect, it requires a ton of micromanagement to use right and keep everyone alive whilst taking out enemies. Plus, if you run out of ammo, you're just going to be tired from all the running around and forced to send units into melee that likely can't fight their way out of the paper bag. So now we've been through these 4 different strategies, you're probably wondering which one is best, and of course the answer is, well, it depends. Like I mentioned, these strats work best for certain factions, but a lot of them flat out don't work for others. You can't rush with the dwarves even if you use their fastest units, just like you can't turtle with the vampire counts with their total lack of ranged firepower. So first of all, you have to pick something that works for your faction and the army you're building, and after that, there's still not a set in stone right answer. Some battles you'll be able to turtle just fine and take enemies out with ranged firepower. Sometimes you'll need to incorporate a little bit of flanking and some hammer and anvil. Sometimes you'll need to rush up to the enemy and engage them as they move towards you. What I'm getting at is the real best strategy in Warhammer 3 is a mix of all these techniques and more. No 2 battle scenarios are the exact same, so use what you have to get the job done and play for what's in front of you. And if you want to know what to do with every single unit you can ever find in front of you, then click on this video here where I go over how to use every single unit in the game.